In 1348, a man named Richard the Raker fell through the rotting wooden planks that covered his own cesspool and drowned in several feet of accumulated human waste. Not just his waste, but his neighbor's waste, too, collected over what may have been years. And the thing that should genuinely disturb you about that story is that nobody treated it as unusual because it wasn't unusual, because that was just ordinary life in medieval England. Or that is the world you would have walked into if you'd been alive in 1348. The line between civilization and open sewage came down to a few planks of wood. Roughly 80% of the population spent their lives doing backbreaking agricultural labor. The concept of germs wouldn't exist for another 5 centuries, and the most sophisticated medical explanation for why millions of people were dying pointed to the planets being in the wrong position. You would not have survived any of this. And over the next several minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly why. Starting with the first thing you'd notice. The smell would hit you before anything else. London in 1348 held roughly 70 to 80,000 people packed inside a walled city of about 1 square mile, which gave it a population density competitor to modern Manhattan. Manhattan, of course, has plumbing, garbage collection, and a sewer system that doesn't empty into the same river people drink from. What London had none of those things, but what London did have was the Fleet River. The Fleet ran just west of the city walls and served simultaneously as a trade route, a source of drinking water and an open sewer. Slaughterhouses dumped animal blood, bones, hides, and offal directly into it, while tanneries poured in chemical runoff and latrines emptied into it from both banks. The lower portion eventually became so choked with filth that it earned the name the Fleet Ditch. But in 1348, it still technically qualified as a river. 60 years before the plague even arrived, the stench from the Fleet had already grown so overwhelming that a Carmelite prior, the Dominican friars, and the Bishop of Spuri, they all signed a formal petition of complaint. A bishop wrote an official letter about how bad a river smelled. And that tells you something about the river. The authorities' solution in 1343 cess was to instruct butchers to dump their waste into the Fleet so that animal remains would stop accumulating in the streets. One historian dryly noted that this turned out to be less than ideal, and that was the baseline before the Black Death showed up. King Edward III himself wrote to the mayor of London in 1349, complaining that the streets were, and I'm paraphrasing, only slightly foul with human feces, and the air of the city poisoned to the great danger of anyone passing through us, especially in a time of infectious disease. The King of England had to personally tell the mayor of his own capital city to clean up the human waste in the streets. That was your normal every single morning. Pigs roamed freely through the streets of many towns, and these were not the plump pink animals you're imagining. Medieval pigs were smaller and closer in appearance to wild boars with tusks and wiry hair and a temperament to match. They rooted up gardens, attacked passers-by, exhumed bodies from graveyards, and reportedly killed children. The Hospital Brothers of St. Anthony had special royal privileges, allowing their pigs to wander the streets wearing little bells, which at least gave you a warning before a tusked animal charged you from an alley. And the city of Exat had a stream running through it that carried the official name Shitbrook, not as slang, but on actual maps that people used for directions. Now, let me take you inside a medieval home, your toilet. If you were fortunate enough to live in a castle, went by the name Guard Robe, which was a small stone chamber projecting from the castle wall on corbels, with a hole that dropped waste into the moat, or a cesspit far below. The word guard robe translates to wardrobe, and clothing was stored near the toilet on purpose because ammonia fumes from the accumulated waste below were believed to repel lice and fleas. Your best suit hung directly above a shaft of human excrement by design. During the siege of Château-Gallardade in France in 1204, enemy soldiers gained entry to the fortress by climbing up through a latrine shaft, which tells you everything about both the size of these openings and the determination of medieval armies. commoners urged a chamber pot at night and emptied it into the cesspit each morning across much of medieval Europe. Thus, the relevant sanitation legislation consisted of an ordinance requiring you to shout, "Look out below," 3 times before dumping a full chamber pot out the window and into the street. That was the actual law. Shout a warning 3 times, and then let gravity do the rest. Cesspits were supposed to sit at least 2 and 1/2 ft from your neighbor's property if stone-lined, or 3 and 1/2 ft if they weren't. Seepage into neighboring properties and wells happened constantly, while one caseful from 1347 found 2 men who had been secretly piping their waste through a hidden channel into a neighbor's cellar, and nobody caught on until the cellar overflowed. Here's the thing about medieval hygiene that most people get completely wrong. The popular image of universally filthy medievals who never bathed and wallowed in grime for decades at a stretch is mostly a myth. And I say mostly because the reality turns out to be both more interesting and more tragic than the stereotype suggests. Medieval people washed daily in many cases. Cleaning your hands and face every morning was standard across all social classes. And etiquette manuals instructed people to keep their fingernails clean, avoid touching ears or nose with bare hands, and wipe their lips before drinking from a shared cup. And soap had arrived from the Middle East with returning crusaders as a luxury product, while common people made their own version from animal fat and wood ash. Linen undergarments did the heavy lifting of medieval hygiene by absorbing sweat and dirt, and the wealthy changed them every day. The historian Ian Mortimer pointed out that there were many ways to remove dirt beyond just soap and water. Public bathhouse operated everywhere across medieval Europe. Thus, 32 lined the streets of Paris by the 13th century, while souk across the Tempoms from London had 18 hot baths. Vienna had 29, and Nuremberg boasted 14, earning a reputation as one of the cleanest cities on the continent. Even small towns often ran a bathhouse connected to the local bakery, sharing heat from the bread ovens. A 12th century writer named Alexander Neckham reported being woken up by street criers shouting that the baths were hot, whilst medieval illustrations show people sitting in large wooden tubs with boards laid across them as dining tables, eating and socializing while they soaked. And the 14th century Italian physician Maino de Minor cataloged 57 different ways to take a bath. The man had strong opinions about bathing. Some of those bathhouse, particularly the famous Suffolk stews, doubled as brothel. The sex workers who operated there went by the name Winchester geese, was because the stews were licensed and regulated by the Bishop of Winchester. And a 15th century document laid out 39 rules governing their operation. The medieval church regulated both your spiritual hygiene and the hygiene of your local brothel with equal bureaucratic enthusiasm. Monks themselves had a more complicated relationship with water. Most monastic orders limited full baths to 2 or 3 times per year to avoid the sin of vanity and bodily indulgence. And St. Benedict's rule declared that bathing shall seldom be permitted to those who are well, especially the young. St. Francis of Assisi went further and considered an unwashed body a stinking badge of piety. And yet, monastic bathhouse existed all over, with Cluny Abbey maintaining one that held 12 tubs and 45 toilet cubicles, while Canterbury's Christ Church Monastery had piped water running to its kitchen, washhouse, and infirmary from settling tanks as early as 1150. The church was simultaneously suspicious of bathing and professionally committed to plumbing. Across the Mediterranean, the Islamic world operated on an entirely different level. 10th century Cordoba, under Islamic rule, held a population of over 500,000, with street lighting, running water, and 300 public bathhouse. All at a time when London had roughly 10,000 inhabitants using the Tempa maze as both water supply and toilet. The Hadith declared cleanliness to be half of faith, and Muslims performed ritual washing 5 times daily before prayer. Arab physicians had dedicated entire chapters of their medical texts to hygiene, soap making, deodorants, and toothpaste. Crusaders who traveled to the Holy Land were described by Arab writers as having a total disregard for personal hygiene, with their noblest knights reportedly boasting about bathing no more than 4 times a year. Not so medieval Europeans were not the unwashed savages of popular imagination. But compared to their Islamic contemporaries, they lagged far behind. And what makes all of this tragic rather than just colorful is that they genuinely tried. They cared about cleanliness, they pursued it, and they built infrastructure around it. None of that mattered because the one thing they lacked, the one thing that would have actually saved them, was any understanding of what was really making them sick, as disease in 1348 was explained through 3 frameworks, and all 3 were wrong. The first was humoral theory inherited from the ancient Greeks, which held that your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And that health meant balance, while sickness meant one humor had grown out of proportion. Treatment meant restoring that balance through bloodletting, purging, or induced vomiting. The second framework was my asthma theory. Thus, the belief that corrupt or poisonous air rising from rotting matter, swamps, or unclean environments caused disease. That belief explains why people carried bouquets of flowers pressed to their noses, why homes were fumigated with burning herbs and incense, and why commanders, small scented balls of herbs and spices, were worn around the neck. Floors got scattered with rushes and aromatic herbs like basil, chamomile, lavender, mint, and rosemary, all to mask the smells. Well, it wasn't superstition exactly because it followed a kind of logic. Rotting things smell bad. Sick people smell bad, and places with bad smells have more sick people. The conclusion that bad air causes disease made sense from the evidence available, even though it was completely wrong. The third framework was the simplest and the most psychologically devastating of all. God was angry, you sinned, and this plague was your punishment. In October of 1348, King Philip VI of France commissioned the medical faculty of the University of Paris, the most prestigious medical institution in Europe, to produce an official report on what was causing the plague. 49 of the finest medical minds on the continent put their heads together and concluded that a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius on March 20th, 1345, had corrupted the atmosphere. Drawing on Aristotle, as they explained that Jupiter's hot and moist nature combined with Mars had caused rot and putrefaction in the air itself. And this report became the single most widely circulated and authoritative medical explanation of the plague across all of Europe. The people at highest risk, according to these 49 experts, included those bunged up with evil humors, people following a bad lifestyle with too much exercise, sex, and bathing, persistent worriers, and corpulent people with a ruddy complexion. If you were overweight and anxious, the University of Paris had all but declared you a dead man walking. Treatments matched the understanding perfectly. Bloodletting, meaning a doctor would open a vein and drain your blood, stood as the most common medical intervention for almost any illness. Plague buboes got lanced or cauterized with a hot iron. One popular remedy, called the Vicary method, involved placing a live chicken's bare rump directly against the swollen bubo to draw out the poison. Theek, a compound of up to 80 ingredients including myrrh, cinnamon, and opiates, had been considered a universal antidote since antiquity. 4 thieves' vinegar circulated as another supposed cure. Prayer rounded out the options. None of it worked. Guided, a personal physician to Pope Clement VI, and one of the most respected surgeons in Europe, wrote with devastating honesty that physicians felt useless and ashamed because they did not dare visit the sick for fear of infection. And when they did visit them, they could do very little and accomplished nothing. Cholia himself contracted the plague, suffering a continuous fever and a bubo in the groin, and somehow became one of the rare few to survive. Well, he had advised the Pope to keep fires burning continuously in his chambers, which may have unknowingly helped repel fleas. Another physician named Raymond Chalon de Vivas recognized that bloodletting was completely useless against the plague, but continued prescribing it anyway. admitting that he reserved the treatment specifically for members of the Roman Curia whom he disliked. That might be the most honest thing a doctor has ever said. And the iconic plague doctor costume, with a beak mask filled with dried flowers and herbs, didn't exist yet. A French physician named Chaldel wouldn't invent it until 1619, and the famous engraving of Dr. Beak dates to 1656. Only 2 physical examples of the masks have ever been found, both from 17th century Germany. If you're picturing a sinister figure in a bird mask looming over your sick bed, you're about 3 centuries too early. In 1348, your doctor just showed up with a knife and a chicken. The medicine was spectacularly bad, and I truly cannot emphasize that enough. But we haven't even gotten to what you were eating and drinking yet, and that's worth staying for. London's primary water supply ran through the Great Conduit authorized in 1236, a system of lead and timber pipes stretching roughly 3 to 4 miles from springs at Tyburn to a cistern in Cheapside. 12 conduit systems served the city by the mid-14th century, was with water dispensed from taps and hand-delivered to residences by workers called water cobs for a fee. That infrastructure was genuinely impressive for the era. The problem was that the same rivers and streams feeding the water supply were also receiving the output of cesspools, latrines, slaughterhouses, and tanneries, with no separation between clean water and wastewater at all. You were drinking downstream from your own toilet. Despite what you've heard, our medieval people did not drink beer instead of water because the water was too dangerous. The historian Jim Chiovalia and the medievalist Tim O'Neill have both documented extensive evidence of routine water consumption, and health manuals recommended drinking from cool springs. About 90% of Europe's population lived in rural areas with easy access to clean streams. AE was widely consumed, but primarily as a caloric supplement for laborers rather than a water replacement. And medieval ales contained roughly 1% alcohol compared to 5% in a modern beer. You weren't safely getting drunk instead of drinking the water. You were just drinking the water. The myth that medieval people used spices to mask the taste of rotten meat is also wrong. Wealthy people who could afford exotic spices could easily afford fresh meat, while the poor who might eat questionable meat couldn't remotely afford spices. And laws existed punishing merchants who sold spoiled food with thyme in the public stocks. Food safety had its own genuine nightmares, though. Ergotism, known as St. Anoni's fire, came from a fungus called Clavisps purpura that grew on rye grain, especially after cold or wet winters, and contaminated bread could trigger convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene of the extremities, and death. Rye was a staple across medieval Europe, or which meant every single day when you ate bread, you were rolling the dice. Your teeth, oddly enough, represent one of the few areas where medieval people had it better than you'd expect. Only about 20% of medieval teeth show any sign of decay in the archaeological record, compared to up to 90% in early 20th century populations. And the reason comes down to an almost total absence of sugar in the diet. People cleaned their teeth with rough linen cloths, hazel twigs, and herbal powders made from sage, rosemary, pepper, and salt. While Guy Chauliac himself recommended removing excess calculus and using antiseptic goggles, Gerald of Wales noted that Welsh peasants rubbed their teeth until they shone like ivory. The bigger problem was tooth wear from eating stone-ground bread daily, with the grit slowly grinding enamel to nothing over a lifetime. When a real dental problem did develop, and your options are coming down to a barber surgeon armed with pliers and no anesthetic operating under the belief that tiny worms living inside the tooth caused cavities. Treatment involved holding a burning candle close to the tooth to smoke the worms out. Your teeth probably wouldn't rot, but everything else about medieval dentistry would make you wish they had. And it was into this world. Or if this world of cesspools and contaminated water and fleet ditches and brooks and clothing hung above sewage shafts and rye bread that could give you gangrene, that the Black Death arrived. We now know it started in Central Asia. A 2022 study published in Nature traced the origin to Ka Jagach near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, where tombstones from 1338 and 1339, inscribed in Syriac site pestilence and DNA analysis, confirmed the ancestral strain of Yenia pestis, the bacterium that would go on to kill tens of millions. From Central Asia, the plague traveled along trade routes to Crimea, where in 1346, the Mongolian horde under Janibeg besieged the Genoese trading port of Kaffa. The plague devastated the besieging army, and according to the chronicler Gabriel Deus, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls, though modern scholars debate whether that actually happened. What is certain is that Genoese merchants fled Kaffa by ship while carrying the plague with them. 12 of those ships docked at Messina, Sicily in October of 1347, and most of the sailors aboard were already dead. The living were covered in black swellings, buboes oozing blood and pus, and the city expelled the ships almost immediately. But none of that mattered because the plague was already ashore. Genoa, Venice, and Marseille fell by January of 1348. Florence followed in March, Paris and Bordeaux in June. That by late June, the plague had crossed the English Channel to the port of Malcolm Regis in Dorset, and by November it reached London. It moved faster than armies, faster than news could travel. Giovanni Boccaccio, writing from Florence, described how the plague leapt from the sick to the healthy through normal contact, even from touching clothing or objects, spreading like a fool catching dry wood. Brother abandoned brother in his account. Uncle abandoned nephew. Sister abandoned brother, and parents abandoned their own children. Some walked about, carrying posies of flowers pressed to their noses, believing the fragrance would comfort the brain against the stench of corpses and sick bodies filling the air. Between March and July, he claimed over 100,000 died within the walls of Florence alone. In Siena, a man named Agnolo Dura del Grasso left behind 5 words that have echoed through 7 centuries. I buried my 5 children with my own hands, for no one wept for any death, he wrote, because all awaited death, and great pits were dug and piled deep with bodies, some so poorly covered that dogs dragged them out and devoured them in the streets. Florence lost between 50 and 80% of its population in those months. Venice lost over 90,000. A friar in the tiny French village of Givry, who kept meticulous death records, normally counted 28 or 29 funerals a year. But in 1348, he recorded 649 deaths, half of them in September alone across Europe. Modern scholarship places the death toll between 30 and 65% of the entire population. Within 6 years, the historian Ole Benedictor puts the figure at roughly 60%, about 50 million people out of 80 million. 500 years would pass before Florence's population recovered to pre-plague levels. Pope Clement VI, sitting in Avenue, they consecrated the entire Rann River so that bodies could be dumped directly into it with the church's blessing, because the cemeteries were full and there was simply nowhere left to put the dead. 400 burials a day at its peak, and he lost at least 6 cardinals in a single year. Gentile Doligno, chief physician at the University of Perugia and one of Italy's most eminent medical scholars, wrote multiple treatises on treating the plague, has continued seeing patients when other doctors fled and died of the disease on June 18, 1348. Princess Joan, daughter of Edward III, died on September the 2nd in Bordeaux on her way to her own wedding. Alonso X, 11th of Castile, became the only reigning European monarch killed directly by the plague, dead in March 1350 while besieging Gibraltar. None of their titles bought them a single extra day. Desperate responses followed. Flagellants marched through Germany, Flanders on Holland, Bohemia, and Denmark. Men stripped to the waist and organized in campaigns lasting exactly 33 and 2 days, one for each year of Christ's earthly life. They beat their own backs with leather thongs tipped with iron hooks until blood ran freely, stopping in each town for no more than a single day. Pope Clement condemned the movement on October 20th, 1349, and ordered it disbanded. But the public paid no attention whatsoever as Jewish communities were massacred across Europe, scapegoated as well poisoners. Roughly 2,000 Jews burned alive in Strasbourg in February of 1349 before the plague had even reached the city, murdered for causing a disease that hadn't arrived. 6,000 died in mines in a single day. 300 to 600 burned in Basel. Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls defending the Jews, as pointing out in July and September of 1348 that Jews were dying of the plague at the same rate as Christians. It made no difference. And here is the darkest irony in this entire story. The plague and the terror it generated helped destroy the one thing medieval people had been doing that was actually unknowingly good for them: bathing. In the decades and centuries after the Black Death, the belief took hold that warm water opened the pores of the skin and allowed disease to enter the body. But bathhouses that had been thriving social institutions for generations began to close, and the syphilis epidemic of the 1490s accelerated the collapse. By 1526, the philosopher Erasmus observed that public baths, which had been the height of fashion in the Low Countries just 25 years earlier, had completely vanished. Henry VIII ordered the Sodok stews closed in 1546. The historian Catherine Aschenberg demonstrated that Europeans became measurably less clean during the Renaissance and early modern period than they had been during the Middle Ages, which means the fear of disease made people more vulnerable to disease. The 17th century, not the 14th, turned out to be the true age of filth. You wouldn't have lived to see any of that because in 1348, your odds of survival were roughly a coin flip and probably worse. You would have lived in a city that smelled like an open latrine, drunk water contaminated by the waste of your neighbors, and eaten bread that might give you hallucinations and gangrene. A doctor who believed the stars had made you sick would have drained your blood. And if that didn't work, he might have pressed a live chicken against your swollen lymph nodes. And you would have watched somewhere between 1/3 and 2/3 of everyone you'd ever known die in the space of a few months. But if you survived, the world that greeted you was so depopulated that sheep and cattle wandered through abandoned fields and rotting crops with no one left to tend them. Henry Knighton, a chronicler from Leicester, put it plainly when he wrote that many villages and hamlets became quite desolate, and no one was left in the houses because the people who once inhabited them were dead. Nobody could hire a reaper for less than 8 pence with food, or a mower for less than 12, because labor suddenly carried value when so many laborers were gone. Ibn Khaldun, writing in 1377, captured the full weight of what had happened. Civilization, in both East and West, was visited by a destructive plague which devastated nations and caused populations to vanish, he wrote. And it swallowed up many of the good things of civilization, and the entire inhabited world changed. And it did change. The world before 1348 and the world after bore almost no resemblance to each other, but so many laborers died that survivors could demand higher wages. And Edward III's attempt to freeze pay at pre-plague levels with the Statute of Laborers in 1351 collapsed almost immediately. Serfdom began its slow disintegration. Venice pioneered quarantine. Dubrovnik passed the world's first formal quarantine law in 1377, requiring 30 days of mandatory isolation on a small island off the coast. Tess Milan, under the Visconti family, walled up entire houses with infected and healthy people sealed inside together. A measure that was brutal and horrifying and effective, leaving the city with only 15% mortality while surrounding cities lost half their populations. Public health, epidemiology, and the very notion that governments carry a duty to protect citizens from disease all trace their origins back to the desperate and often cruel responses to the Black Death. But in 1348, none of that had happened yet. In 1348, you had a chamber pot, a guard robe, a river full of slaughterhouse waste, a doctor who thought your humors were unbalanced, and a prayer that the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars would sort itself out. Your clothing was stored above a pile of human waste to keep the fleas away, and that counted as good hygiene at the time, which tells you everything you need to know about the 14th century.